In a frozen corner of the United States, an Arctic crisis is unfolding. This Alaskan island is disappearing. Its people forced to abandon their homes because of the pace of global warming. But when American scientists raise the alarm, they say they were obstructed.
I have not seen this in my experience in upwards of 40 years of working in the science world. I have colleagues who I know in government, who work in government laboratories, who feel that it's impossible for them to speak their mind in the precise way that they used to be able to speak.
The leaders of the most powerful nation on Earth are accused of editing reports on global warming.
They would come back altered in such a way as to systematically play down the global warming problem.
Tonight, Panorama investigates accusations that a global warming cover-up has been underway in America.
It reminds me of the process that occurred in the old Soviet Union, for example, where, the public is given information that the government wants them to hear rather than an honest description of the situation.
Vital time has been lost, while scientists say they've been working in a climate of fear. Rick Piltz is a whistleblower. He left his job in government appalled at the suppression of information he'd witnessed. The Bush administration now officially accepts that global warming is real and that humans contribute to it. But the president still seems to be wrestling with the basic issue.
I mean, this is not buried in the past. Just a couple of weeks ago, the president in the Q&A at a public event had a question from someone from Australia.
Brendan O'Connor from Australia.
Thank you.
I've got a question about global warming.
What are you doing about it? What about it?
What is your plan?
Good. First of all, there is...
And the president said, yes, global warming. The globe is warming.
The globe is warming?
The fundamental debate, is it man-made or natural?
The fundamental debate, is it man-made or natural?
That's not a fundamental debate. It's not a fundamental debate in the science community. To put it that way is to misrepresent the intelligence on the problem, and that's what they were doing, I think.
It's in the Arctic that the tragedy facing the Earth is most powerfully evident. This is the worst ice melt in many thousands of years. Here, amidst this spectacle, international scientists compiled a startling report, warning what that means for this century. If the warming continues, it said, seas may rise by as much as a meter. Major species face extinction. But its chief author says delays meant its recommendations were kept from America's public during the 2004 elections.
There are many who claim the delays are deliberate because the meetings that needed to be held were during an election year in the United States. Whether that's in fact true, only the United States can say. But many people believe that the delay was due to that.
Bob Carell led the team that wrote the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment Report. He took us to the far north of Alaska, where some of the research took place. The island of Shishmaref came into view. The houses have started collapsing, quite literally. The ice they're built on is melting. And with the ice that holds this shoreline together crumbling too, this island is being swallowed up into the vast, flat expanse of the sea. For all the scientists write about climate change, this is the reality. Carell's report said events here are critical, because entire coastlines and islands worldwide will go the same way if seas keep rising due to warming. His report's key message, one of policy, that governments had to cut greenhouse gas emissions urgently. When it heard this, the Bush administration stepped in.
There was a memo prepared by the U.S. State Department. Didn't have a title on it, wasn't signed.
How do you know who it was from?
Because it was attached to an email from the State Department in the U.S.
The memo asked the scientists to delay work on their policy recommendations. The US government argued that the preparation of the report had a fundamental flaw. They wanted its authors to stick to the science. This was seen as a delaying tactic.
The observation of other countries were that the United States, because of its position on the climate change, didn't wish to have this sort of process carry out so rapidly during this current administration's view.
Was it because of the nature of what the report was saying?
Well, I think it's because the scientific side of it was such a strong statement about climate change to the point where it was now very difficult to say that climate change is not occurring, and that if it's occurring, therefore one must do something about it.
A year later, in October 2004, the report was finally ready for publication. But now it was just 1 month before America's elections. The report's publication was delayed until immediately after the nation voted. We put these points to President George Bush's senior advisor on the environment, James Connaughton. Bob Carell has told us that there were repeated attempts to delay the publication of the policy document. Why was that?
I'm not familiar with that.
You're not familiar with the Arctic Assessment Report?
No, I'm very familiar with the Arctic Assessment Report. It was funded in large measure by the United States. So I'm very familiar with the report. I'm just not familiar with the allegations you're describing.
Well, Bob Carell, the chief scientist involved in it, has told us categorically that the actual policy document's publication was delayed in the run-up to the 2004 elections.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that at all.
Right.
By
the end of the century, much of the Arctic could be unrecognizable. Alaska's the last giant bastion of America's wilderness. But in their last election, Americans were not able to test George Bush on what he would do about the Arctic Report's findings, or where it stood in his priorities. The world had already been witnessing wild weather for years. But in 2001, scientists under the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, formed a consensus on the causes. They agreed in the strongest terms yet that man was largely responsible for global warming.
The report you heard today states more categorically that we humans are affecting the Earth's climate system.
The chairman of the scientific body, a British-born American, said governments should act.
This indeed adds impetus for the governments of the world to find ways to live up to the commitments to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases.
The statement was not welcomed by everyone. Some in America's energy industry felt threatened. After a key speech on the subject, Dr. Watson felt the hostility.
After that speech, a number of individuals from the private sector came up to me and said that they thought the speech was basically a very strong speech, it was an emotional speech, and it was the sort of speech they didn't ever personally want to hear again.
George Bush's new cabinet had close ties to industry. The vice president, Dick Cheney, used to run Halliburton, an oil services company. In charge of commerce was Donald Evans, former chief of a Denver-based oil company. The Treasury was run by Paul O'Neill, the former chairman of the giant manufacturing company Alcoa. And Andrew Card, chief of staff, was formerly a senior car industry lobbyist. Just months into office, Bush formally rejected the Kyoto process, in which the world was uniting to cut emissions. He'd opposed Kyoto before he became president. His reasons are the same today.
I told the world I thought the Kyoto was a lousy deal for America. And I'll tell you why it was a lousy deal for America. It meant that we had to cut emissions below 1990 levels, which would have meant I would have presided over massive layoffs and economic destruction. Just don't ask any questions.
Then, in 2001, he used exactly the same argument to reverse his pre-election promise to cap U.S. emissions independently. It fell on Christine Todd Whitman to explain this to a dumbfounded world.
He disengaged in a way that lent credence to the belief that many people have the United States just doesn't care about the rest of the world. And we disengaged talking about, well, this is bad for our economy, and we really don't care what the rest of you think. If it's bad for us, we're not going to do it.
Next came this from the oil industry.